It was an ordinary autumn evening when the illusion of our family safety shattered completely. We were gathered around the dining table, the crisp air of late October lingering just outside the windows, when my son-in-law's father lost control. In a flash of unprovoked rage, he reached across the table, grabbed my 9-year-old grandson by the collar of his shirt, lifted him clear off his feet, and threw him against the dining room wall. The impact was violent enough to leave a visible fracture in the drywall. Instead of horror, my daughter-in-law's mother simply offered a cold, satisfied smile, remarking that the boy finally needed to learn some discipline. The child was sobbing so violently he gasped for air, completely traumatized. Without a word, I stood up from my chair, walked calmly into the kitchen, and dialed a number. To everyone sitting in that room, I was nothing more than a frail, low-profile retiree living off a modest state pension, struggling with mild arthritis. They viewed me as an insignificant old man who posed no threat. They had absolutely no idea about the career I had left behind or the resources at my disposal. Before I reveal the chain of events that followed that phone call, take a brief moment to subscribe to the channel and share in the comments section where you are tuning in from. I read through every single submission. I am currently 68 years old, and though my name isn't the focal point of this account, my background is. For over 3 decades, I operated as a senior federal forensic accountant for the Department of Justice, specializing in complex white-collar crime syndicates out of our regional field office in Columbus, Ohio. When I officially retired a few years back, I carried with me multiple commendations from the Bureau's highest leadership and a personal directory of contacts who still answer my calls on the first ring. Yet to my son, Ethan, his wife, Chloe, and particularly her wealthy parents, I was just a quiet, unassuming senior living in a modest suburb, driving a 15-year-old sedan and hunting for discounts at the local grocery store on weekdays. Because of family friction, I hadn't been permitted to see my grandson, Leo, in nearly 5 months. The sudden invitation had arrived out of nowhere on a chilly Friday afternoon, while I was clearing dead leaves from my front lawn. The text didn't come from Ethan, it came directly from Chloe. It was brief, detached, and structured like a business transaction, noting that they were hosting a family dinner on Sunday at 4 o'clock because Leo had been asking for me. Standing in the cold air, I gripped my rake and reread those few words repeatedly. Leo wanted to see me. A familiar ache tightened in my chest. He was my only grandchild, and when his birthday had passed 2 months prior, I wasn't even invited to celebrate. I had sent him a birthday card containing $100 and a detailed sketch of a sailboat, remembering how he used to talk about wanting to explore the water. 2 weeks later, that exact envelope was delivered back to my house, stamped as undeliverable, with the rejection written in Chloe's distinct handwriting. I chose never to mention it to Ethan. Sometimes, as a parent, you simply internalize the pain to keep the peace. I replied to her message confirming my attendance and asking if I should bring a dish, but she never bothered to text back. When Sunday arrived, the Midwestern sky was a heavy, dull sheet of gray, carrying that distinct scent of autumn wood smoke where the clouds threaten rain for hours but never deliver. I made the 40-minute drive to their neighborhood in Dublin, an affluent suburb filled with identical, newly constructed estates, multi-car garages, and manicured lawns. The entire lifestyle was funded by Chloe's father, a man named Sterling Vance. Sterling owned a prominent network of high-end luxury vehicle dealerships spanning central Ohio. He operated 3 separate locations, and he made sure every person he met was fully aware of his success. I had to park my aging sedan along the curb because the sprawling driveway was entirely occupied. There was Chloe's luxury crossover, Ethan's modest commuter car, Sterling's premium SUV, and a pristine white sports coupe belonging to his wife, Beatrice. Sitting alone in my vehicle for a moment, looking at that row of gleaming, expensive paint jobs compared to my dusty brown car, I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of irony. 30 years ago, I had built the federal case that sent a man to prison for purchasing an identical fleet of luxury cars, using funds he had systematically embezzled from a corporate pension plan. The world has a peculiar way of repeating itself. Chloe opened the front door wearing an expensive designer apron over a cashmere sweater, offering a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. She remarked that I was early, though a quick glance at my watch showed I had arrived exactly 4 minutes prior to the invitation. When I offered to wait out in my car, she dismissed it, instructing me to step inside and remove my shoes. The interior smelled intensely of roasted herbs and old money. Patted in my socks, I walked into the main living room and found Leo sitting quietly on the rug with a box of crayons. The moment his eyes met mine, his entire expression lit up. He dropped his coloring book, sprinted across the space, and threw his arms tightly around my legs, whispering how happy he was that I actually showed up. I knelt down carefully, my joints cracking loudly in the quiet room, and held him close. He smelled of childhood shampoo and wax crayons, but as I held him, I realized he felt noticeably thinner than the last time I had seen him back in the spring. His hair had grown out, and as he shifted his arm, I caught sight of a fading yellowish bruise on his forearm, the kind that had been inflicted a week or two prior. I looked up to see my son Ethan standing in the kitchen doorway. At 36, he was a naturally tall man, but he stood with a pronounced defensive hunch, as if he had spent the last several years constantly apologizing for his own existence. Before we could exchange more than a muted greeting, Sterling Vance stepped into the room. He was a massive individual, standing over 6 feet 2 inches with a broad frame, a thick silver mustache, and a complexion permanently reddened by either fine bourbon or unyielding arrogance. It was barely 3 in the afternoon, but he was already holding a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey. Beatrice followed closely behind him, a petite, severe woman with perfectly rigid, styled blonde hair, mindlessly turning a heavy strand of pearls between her fingers like a rosary of social judgment. Sterling looked me up and down with an amused smirk, loudly telling Ethan to fetch his father a drink, because I looked like I desperately needed one. I declined politely as Sterling claimed the best armchair in the room, the premium leather one that Ethan had proudly purchased with his own savings when they first bought the house. Sterling leaned back, asking about my retirement and referring to my decades of federal service as simple, low-level administrative paper pushing. I simply told him I worked in accounting. He dragged the word out with total disdain, chuckling about bean counting and pencil pushing before winking at his wife. He boasted about the business empire he had built from scratch, 3 locations and dozens of employees, before pointedly asking Ethan if he ever wondered what it felt like to actually achieve something substantial. Ethan kept his eyes glued to the carpet until Chloe called out from the kitchen that dinner was served. We were seated for dinner with an intentional hierarchy. Leo was placed directly between his mother and Beatrice, while I was relegated to the far end of the table, closest to the exit door. Sterling sat prominently at the head of the table with Ethan positioned to my left. Chloe presented a beautifully prepared dinner of roasted poultry, mashed potatoes, and seasoned green beans. The layout looked like a page from a gourmet cooking magazine, but to me it tasted like cardboard. I simply chewed my food, remained quiet, and maintained polite conversation. Sterling turned his attention to my son, aggressively asking how things were progressing at the shipping facility. Ethan managed logistics for a major regional supplier, a stable, secure position with excellent benefits that he had held for nearly a decade. When Ethan replied that things were going well, Sterling scoffed, loudly stating that he had told Chloe multiple times that her husband could easily triple his current salary if he would just swallow his pride and come work commercial sales at one of the dealerships. Ethan quietly muttered that he wasn't really built for high-pressure sales, to which Sterling barked a laugh, insultingly replying that Ethan wasn't built like a real man at all. Beatrice joined in the laughter while Chloe kept her eyes on her plate with a passive smile. I continued eating in silence, observing the room. Sterling then pointed his fork in my direction, declaring that Ethan's real problem was that I had raised him to be entirely too passive, sitting there like a quiet church mouse. He claimed that a soft upbringing is exactly how you end up with a son who doesn't know how to close a business deal. Beatrice insincerely told her husband to be nice, though her face was twisted into a smirk. Underneath the table, Leo was mindlessly swinging his legs the way young children often do when they are restless. His foot accidentally bumped against the heavy wooden table leg, causing Sterling's whiskey glass to wobble slightly. A single drop of amber liquid spilled over the rim, staining the immaculate white tablecloth. The atmosphere instantly shifted as Sterling's face darkened with intense rage, demanding to know what he had previously said about kicking the furniture. Leo froze instantly, repeatedly whispering apologies as panic set in. Ethan attempted to intervene, his voice carrying a fragile, rare tone of defiance as he stated that the boy hadn't done it on purpose. Sterling snapped, cutting Ethan off by stating he was dealing with his own grandson. He ordered Leo to stand up and come to his side of the table. Leo looked toward his mother for protection, but Chloe deliberately looked away at her plate. The child slowly climbed out of his chair and walked around the table, his shoulders instinctively hunching up toward his ears in fear. During my decades with the Department of Justice, I had seen hardened criminals walk with that exact defensive posture into federal interrogation rooms. A 9-year-old child should never know how to walk that way. What occurred next unfolded in a matter of seconds. Sterling lunged forward, grabbing Leo violently by the collar of his shirt. He stood up fully, ripping the boy completely off the floor so that his feet dangle helplessly in the air. Taking 2 aggressive strides, Sterling slammed my grandson directly into the dining room drywall. A loud impact echoed through the room, followed by a sharp crack from the wall, and a tiny, breathless gasp escaped Leo's lungs as the air was forced out of him. Sterling snarled that kicking wasn't tolerated at his table before releasing his grip. Leo slid down the damaged drywall, collapsing onto the hardwood floor in a heap as he began to sob uncontrollably, the deep, convulsive crying of a terrified child who cannot catch his breath. From her seat across the table, Beatrice calmly sliced another piece of chicken, remarked that the discipline was well-deserved, and criticized Chloe for letting the child run wild. Chloe simply nodded, agreeing with her mother and thanking her father for intervening. Ethan was halfway out of his seat, his face completely drained of color and his hands trembling violently. He looked desperately at his wife, then at her imposing father, and finally down at his sobbing son on the floor. Then, tragically, he sank back into his chair, lowered his head, and picked up his fork to continue eating. I have replayed that exact sequence of events in my mind 1,000 times. I do not harbor anger toward my son for his paralysis. I understand completely what years of emotional abuse in that family dynamic had done to his spirit. The only thing keeping me pinned to my own chair was the calculating realization that if I reacted aggressively or said the wrong thing in that moment, Leo would inevitably be forced to pay a heavier price later when I wasn't there to shield him. I carefully placed my utensils down, folded my cloth napkin, stood up, and stated in a perfectly calm voice that I needed to utilize the restroom. Sterling dismissed me with a wave of his hand, settling back into his chair like a ruler returning to a throne, loudly telling the old-timer to head down the hallway on the left and try not to trip. I walked down the corridor, entered the bathroom, and turned the lock. Sitting on the edge of the porcelain tub, I pulled out my phone and dialed a direct private line I hadn't used since my retirement. The call connected, and the voice on the other end answered, identifying the line as the State Police Major Crimes Division under the command of Lieutenant Miller. I spoke clearly, identifying myself. There was an instant pause before the officer's tone completely shifted, recognizing me immediately as his former supervisor. I gave him the exact address in Dublin, stating that I was actively witnessing the felony physical assault of a minor. I reported that the victim was roughly 9 years old, and the perpetrator was an aggressive adult male, over 6 feet 2 inches, weighing approximately 220 pounds, and visibly intoxicated. I explained that the child had been thrown against the structure hard enough to fracture the wall and was currently incapacitated on the floor. I noted that the mother and grandmother were complicit, with one actively praising the attacker. I assured him I was safe inside the residence, but emphasized that the child required immediate emergency medical personnel. The lieutenant confirmed they were dispatching units instantly, asking for the address one more time. He then inquired if I was capturing any evidence. I informed him that I had been recording audio since entering the bathroom and possessed a clear line of sight toward the dining room from the corner of the hallway, allowing me to capture video for the remainder of the encounter. He instructed me to keep the line active as long as possible, estimating an arrival time of 6 minutes. Before he hung up, I added one critical piece of information. I informed him that the primary suspect was named Sterling Vance, owner of the Vance Automotive Group. I instructed him to issue a direct courtesy notification to the local police chief and the assistant district attorney on duty, warning him that the situation was going to become highly publicized. He assured me he was already executing the requests. I ended the call, splashed cold water over my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror, an aging man with thinning hair and exhausted eyes, silently apologizing to my grandson for allowing things to escalate to this point. I then activated my phone's video camera, held the device discreetly at my hip, and walked back into the dining room. Leo had been forced back into his seat by the time I returned. His eyes were heavily bloodshot and swollen, and he was methodically pushing green beans into his mouth one at a time. It was that mechanical, numbing movement children do when they have learned that total compliance is the only way to avoid further violence. A dark red welt was blooming across the side of his face, and the collar of his shirt was noticeably stretched out and torn. Sterling looked up as I sat down, letting out a loud chuckle and asking if everything had come out all right in the bathroom. I maintained a completely flat expression, replied that everything was fine, and picked up my fork while ensuring my phone's lens remained angled perfectly toward the head of the table. Sterling leaned back comfortably, turning his attention right back to my son, loudly declaring that corporate sales was where the real wealth was. Chloe immediately chimed in, telling Ethan that her father was offering him a massive shortcut to success and that he ought to show some gratitude. She then shifted the topic, inquiring about Leo's enrollment in the Youth Hockey League, noting that the equipment and ice time were becoming entirely too expensive given their current budget. Sterling cut in, waving his fork dismissively and stating that hockey was strictly for wealthy elites and foreigners. He declared that he would enroll the boy in full-contact football instead, claiming it would finally toughen him up. He pointed his utensil directly at Ethan, adding with a smirk that, if you raise a boy to be too soft, he ends up exactly like his father. Throughout the entire insult, I kept the camera perfectly level and continued chewing my food. Chloe suddenly turned toward me, flashing that vacant, rehearsed smile and asking for my opinion on placing Leo into a youth football league. I swallowed my food slowly, took a deliberate sip of water, and stated carefully that whatever sport Leo chose to pursue, he should be allowed to play, as he was an incredibly bright child. Sterling scoffed loudly, stating that intelligence doesn't pay the mortgage but raw aggression does. He looked to his wife for validation, and Beatrice instantly nodded in agreement. Before the conversation could continue, the sudden chime of the front doorbell echoed through the house. Chloe frowned, muttering that they weren't expecting any visitors, while Sterling grumbled that it was likely a salesperson and told her to go throw them off the property. She stood up, smoothing her designer apron, and walked down the foyer. A moment later, I heard the heavy front door swing open, followed immediately by Chloe's sharp, terrified intake of breath. A firm, authoritative male voice boomed through the entryway, announcing that they were officers with the state police and had received an emergency report regarding a severely injured minor at the residence. Chloe's voice cracked with panic as she attempted to block the entrance, loudly claiming that there were no injured children inside and that they were merely having a private family dinner. The officer's tone left absolutely no room for negotiation, as he commanded her to step aside immediately. 2 state troopers marched directly into the dining area. Walking closely behind them was Lieutenant Miller, a seasoned investigator with graying temples whom I had personally mentored over 2 decades ago when he was a young deputy building his very first major financial fraud prosecution. Behind them stood a local supervisor and an emergency medical technician carrying a trauma kit. Sterling half rose from his chair, his face contorted in anger as he demanded to know what the hell was going on. Lieutenant Miller scanned the room, his eyes locking onto Leo's bruised face and swollen eyes. His expression hardened instantly. He bypassed the adults entirely, kneeling down carefully next to my grandson's chair, and spoke in a soft, reassuring voice, introducing himself as a police officer and explaining that his medical partner was just going to look him over to ensure he was completely safe. As the medical technician knelt down to examine the child, Leo looked desperately toward his mother. For the first time that evening, the arrogant veneer completely vanished from Chloe's face, replaced by absolute terror. Sterling's voice boomed across the room as he stood up fully, shouting that this was a case of unlawful harassment on private property and threatening to strip the officers of their badges. The local officer stepped forward, firmly ordering Sterling to sit back down, but Sterling refused, aggressively demanding if the officer had any idea who he was. Lieutenant Miller straightened up and looked directly at me. A subtle, imperceptible nod passed between us. I saw the immediate shift in his eyes, a deep sense of relief, the exact look a responding officer gives when they realize the senior authority on the scene has the situation entirely under control. Turning to Sterling, Miller stated evenly that they were responding to a direct eyewitness report originating from inside the home, detailing a felony physical assault against a child. He commanded Sterling to remain exactly where he was, then turned his gaze back to me, asking if I could officially confirm the details of the emergency call. I set my fork down with absolute precision, wiped my mouth with the cloth napkin, and looked directly into the eyes of the man across the table. I announced my full name, identifying myself clearly as Leo's paternal grandfather. I stated on the record that approximately 22 minutes prior, I had personally witnessed Sterling Vance grab the minor child by his clothing, lift him entirely off the floor, and violently launch him into the dining room wall. I pointed directly to the impact zone, noting the visible structural dent and the hairline fracture splitting the drywall. I further detailed that the child had been rendered completely unable to breathe normally for nearly 40 seconds following the assault, that Beatrice Vance had verbally praised the violence, and that Chloe had actively thanked the perpetrator. I concluded by stating that the victim bore physical marks matching the impact, and that I possessed full digital video documentation of the immediate aftermath. Sterling's face shifted rapidly from a deep, furious purple to a hollow, waxy gray. He stammered in shock, whispering that I had actually called the authorities to his daughter's dining table. Lieutenant Miller cut him off sharply, stating that the residence belonged to Ethan and Chloe, meaning it was entirely out of Sterling's jurisdiction. Sterling lashed out one last time, his voice cracking as he demanded why the officers would take the word of an insignificant, washed-up pencil pusher over his own business reputation. Miller's jaw tightened visibly. He looked Sterling dead in the eye and stated that the man he was insulting had served over 3 decades as a chief forensic specialist for the Department of Justice, having provided expert testimony in over 200 federal criminal trials and having trained Miller himself. He informed Sterling that when a professional of that caliber reports a violent crime, the state acts on it without hesitation. The entire dining room fell into a suffocating silence. Chloe stared at me with her mouth open, looking at me as if a completely different person had suddenly materialized in her home. Beatrice completely froze, her fingers paralyzing against her strand of pearls. Ethan sat completely rigid, staring at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since his early childhood. The look of someone suddenly waking up to realization. The medical technician stood up from Leo's side, turning toward the officers with a serious expression, stating that they needed to transport the boy to the emergency room immediately for comprehensive spinal scans. He noted significant localized tenderness along the upper cervical spine and slightly irregular pupillary responses. Chloe snapped instantly, shouting at them not to touch her son and claiming he didn't need a hospital. Lieutenant Miller intervened coldly, informing her that the medical directive was no longer exclusively her decision to make, turning his attention toward Ethan and noting that the father was also a legal guardian on the scene. Ethan's hands were pressed flat against the table, his knuckles white as if he were grounding himself during a massive tremor. He stood up slowly, his voice completely clear and devoid of his usual hesitation, as he commanded the medical team to take his son to the hospital, announcing that he would be riding in the ambulance right alongside him. Chloe lunged forward verbally, screaming at him not to dare walk out that door. Ethan turned to her, his voice cutting through her panic as he reminded her that she had laughed and thanked her father for throwing their child into a wall. He ignored her entirely, turned back to the medical staff, and repeated that he was leaving with his son. The technician carefully lifted Leo, wrapping a protective medical blanket around his shoulders, and began guiding him toward the front exit. As they passed my position at the end of the table, Leo reached out a trembling hand, catching the edge of my sleeve, and whispered a quiet question, asking if I was going to follow them. I wrapped my hand gently over his, promising him that I would be right behind him. Sterling Vance was placed under arrest in that very dining room at exactly 5:37 on that Sunday afternoon. The troopers forced his arms behind his back and secured the steel cuffs while he was still sitting down, with his cloth dinner napkin still tucked ridiculously into his collar. He was formally charged with felony risk of injury to a minor and third-degree domestic assault. While Beatrice wasn't taken into custody that specific evening, she was issued a severe explicit warning by the responding officers regarding the state's mandatory child protection reporting laws, and was informed that her actions were being directly forwarded for an emergency investigation by the Department of Children and Families. Chloe remained collapsed at the dining table after the police van left, sobbing hysterically. I didn't waste a single second offering her comfort. I walked directly out to my sedan, drove straight to the regional hospital, and took my place in the waiting room right beside my son. The diagnostic imaging revealed a hairline fracture along the child's second cervical vertebra. It was a severe upper spinal injury, the precise type of trauma that, if the angle had shifted by a fraction of an inch or the velocity had been slightly greater, would have confined a 9-year-old to a medical chair permanently, or worse. When the attending physician delivered the prognosis, the last remnants of Ethan's composure shattered. He dropped his face into his palms, his shoulders heaving as he let out a low, ragged sound of absolute despair. I leaned over, casting my arm around his trembling frame, anchoring him as he wept. Through his hands, he kept repeating how he had just sat there, frozen, picking up his utensils, while his own child lay broken on the floor. I held him firmly, speaking directly into his panic, telling him that what mattered was his action afterward, that he had stood up, claimed his son, and extracted him from that toxic environment. He continued to weep for nearly 40 minutes while the fluorescent fixtures overhead hummed monotonously, and the corridor remained quiet. When the crying finally subsided and he could maintain eye contact, he looked at me with an expression of profound confusion, asking who I actually was. I leaned back against the stiff plastic of the waiting room chair, choosing my words deliberately. I told him that first and foremost, I was his father, and that every other title or commendation was simply an occupation I used to hold. He questioned the lieutenant's statement regarding my history with white-collar crime syndicates for the federal government. I confirmed it, explaining that I had deliberately kept my career out of our casual conversations because I never wanted to be introduced at social gatherings as a government agent. I simply wanted to be his dad, the uninteresting old man who drove a faded sedan. A faint, strained laugh broke through his exhaustion as he muttered that I was anything but uninteresting. He then asked why I had never used my background to silence Sterling over the years when he hurled insults or referred to me as a low-level paper pusher. I explained a fundamental truth I had learned across 3 decades of investigative work. Arrogant people will inevitably expose their true nature the moment they believe you are insignificant. Sterling had been documenting his own character flaws for 3 solid years, and with every overbearing comment, I was mentally logging the file, waiting for the inevitable tipping point. I simply hadn't realized the climax would occur on a Sunday afternoon at his dinner table. Ethan remained quiet for a long interval, staring toward the floor before asking a much more painful question about Chloe's reaction, specifically, her thanking her father after the assault. I took a deep breath, validating the gravity of what he had witnessed, and laid out the legal reality ahead. I informed him that the state would aggressively pursue felony charges against Sterling. The child welfare authorities would initiate an intrusive evaluation, and their entire household dynamic would be put under a microscope. I told him he needed to choose a definitive side immediately, either his wife's or his son's, because it was structurally impossible to defend both. He didn't hesitate, keeping his gaze locked on the doors of the pediatric ward, as he firmly stated that his loyalty belonged entirely to his son from that moment forward. The following morning, I placed a call to a prominent legal professional named Judith Vance, no relation to Sterling, who had previously served as a senior prosecutor in the federal district court before transitioning into private matrimonial and family law. She was an exceptionally sharp, fiercely disciplined litigator who specialized in dismantling high-conflict custody disputes involving abusive environments. When I detailed the timeline of the assault, she made it completely clear that she would systematically dismantle their defense, instructing me to deliver the complete incident documentation to her office by mid-week. Immediately afterward, I contacted a former federal colleague named Donald Vance, an expert investigator who had spent 2 decades auditing major corporate operations for the Financial Crimes Division of the Revenue Service. When he answered, he recognized my voice instantly, asking what project I had uncovered. I gave him the corporate listing for the Vance Automotive Group, detailing their 3 locations across the state, and told him I required a comprehensive review of their operational accounting. Donald caught my drift immediately, laughing as he noted that I hadn't lost my investigative instincts and requested 4 days to run the corporate filings. I told him to take 5, fully aware from my extensive career that individuals who display unchecked physical entitlement in their personal relationships almost never maintain lawful, transparent business practices. Magnates who violently assault children on weekends do not submit accurate financial disclosures to the government. Bullying carries a steep structural deficit, and eventually, the audit always catches up with them. 3 days later, Leo was discharged from the hospital, fitted with a supportive neck brace to keep his spine stabilized. The medical team assured us the bone would mend without surgical intervention, requiring about 6 weeks of immobilization, followed by targeted physical therapy. He didn't return to the Dublin house. Instead, he came straight to my home where Ethan had already moved his belongings. Chloe had utterly refused to vacate their estate, And even more telling, she hadn't bothered to visit her own child once during his entire hospital stay. Instead, she had quickly retained a high-priced corporate attorney out of Cincinnati, a man named Henderson, who immediately began filing aggressive motions alleging parental alienation. Henderson had absolutely no idea he was about to step into a courtroom against Judith Vance. During those first 7 days, Leo barely uttered a single word. He would sit silently on my living room sofa, curled up next to my old golden retriever, Cooper, staring blankly at television cartoons without a hint of amusement. The slightest unexpected sound would make him flinch violently. Every single night, the nightmares would wake him, sending him scrambling into Ethan's bed at 3 in the morning for safety. To give him something to look forward to, I went out and bought him a high-quality fishing rod, propping it up prominently in the corner of the room where he could see it every day. I promised him that the absolute second his doctors cleared him, we would drive up to my brother's secluded cabin in Michigan and catch ourselves a massive trout. The very first time I saw Leo smile again was on an evening when he looked up from the couch and quietly asked if I had really been some kind of secret agent. I let out a soft chuckle, explaining that I was never a spy, just a man who looked at spreadsheets. He countered, saying his dad told him I locked up dangerous criminals. I told him that while I did help catch them, the real work was just tracking numbers, which most people found incredibly tedious. Leo thought about that deeply for a moment, then looked at me with total seriousness and announced that he wanted to become an accountant when he grew up. I laughed so hard my eyes watered. 2 weeks into the transition, Donald called me back on my private line, telling me to take a seat before he delivered the findings. The Vance Automotive Group, it turned out, had been operating a massive title washing and curbstoning racket across all 3 of their major dealerships for over 6 years. They were systematically purchasing severely damaged, flood-ruined vehicles from out-of-state salvage auctions, scrubbing the branding through a dummy holding company registered out of Delaware, and flipping them to unsuspecting consumers as certified, accident-free pre-owned cars. Donald mapped out at least $1.4 million in completely hidden, unreported revenue, pointing out clear indicators of federal wire fraud and mail fraud embedded in the consumer financing agreements. On top of that, the dealership's bank accounts showed a blatant pattern of structured cash transactions specifically designed to bypass federal anti-money laundering thresholds. But the real kicker was the documentation for the Delaware Shell Corporation. The individual listed as the sole corporate officer and registered agent wasn't Sterling. It was his wife, Beatrice. She was fully integrated into the financial signatures, elevating her status from a simple passive observer to an active co-principal in a federal criminal conspiracy. I took a slow, calculated breath, suggesting to Donald that an anonymous, highly detailed packet of this caliber should probably find its way into the queue at the Criminal Investigation Division of the Revenue Service, with a carbon copy dropped off at the State Motor Vehicle Board and the Consumer Protection Unit of the Attorney General's office. Donald laughed out loud, calling me an relentless old operative, and promised to have the evidence binders completely finalized by Friday morning. After hanging up, I walked out to my back porch, taking a seat in the brisk November air. Cooper came over, resting his heavy chin right on my knee. Through the screen door, the faint sound of Leo laughing at a television program drifted outside, while Ethan stood in the kitchen, speaking deliberately with Judith about securing an emergency ex parte custody order. I want to make one thing completely clear. I felt no joy that afternoon. There was no celebration, no sense of smug satisfaction. In over 30 years of law enforcement work, I have never taken pleasure in watching a household dismantle itself. What I felt was a cold, absolute certainty. The same quiet relief you experience when you finally locate and patch a structural leak that has been rotting your home from the inside out for months. You don't throw a party. You just finally stop hearing the drip. The criminal prosecution against Sterling Vance moved forward rapidly due to the overwhelming volume of indisputable evidence. The prosecution possessed my high-definition phone video, the comprehensive emergency room diagnostics, the photographic records of the shattered drywall taken by the initial responding officers, and a detailed, sensitive interview Leo completed with a certified pediatric forensic analyst. Sterling's defense representative, a top-tier litigator out of Columbus, desperately attempted to negotiate a plea arrangement to avoid a public spectacle. The state's attorney rejected the offer outright. They were determined to secure a public trial and a definitive conviction. Meanwhile, precisely 6 weeks following that disastrous autumn dinner, A registered courier arrived at Sterling's primary dealership location, delivering an official summons from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Revenue Service. The document formally notified him that the Vance Automotive Group was the primary target of an active federal financial investigation. 3 days later, a secondary notice arrived from the State Licensing Board, executing an immediate emergency suspension of the dealer operating credentials for all 3 automotive locations pending a formal administrative review. Within 48 hours of that suspension, the enterprise's commercial inventory financing line was abruptly terminated by their banking institution, as the loss of valid dealer licenses violated their primary lending covenants. In the span of 7 business days, Sterling Vance collapsed from a wealthy business magnate out on bail to a compromised defendant whose entire commercial footprint was frozen, his corporate accounts placed under federal scrutiny, and his wife ensnared in a parallel criminal conspiracy indictment. He could not comprehend how his empire had evaporated so quickly, and his legal team was equally blindsided. At one point, Sterling placed a frantic, raging phone call to Ethan, screaming through the receiver that my intervention had orchestrated his ruin. Ethan listened quietly to the tirade before calmly stating that the destruction was entirely the result of Sterling's own actions, and severed the connection. Chloe had initiated formal divorce proceedings in early December, utilizing the initial filing as a strategic lever to force Ethan into submission. Her attorney, Henderson, anticipated a quiet, uncontested separation, where Chloe would naturally retain the marital estate and primary physical custody of their son. Instead, his office was served with a massive counter-petition compiled by Judith Vance that very afternoon. The legal packet contained 37 distinct evidentiary exhibits, including the complete hospital files, the initial police reports, the preliminary determinations from the Child Welfare Agency, and 3 separate sworn affidavits from long-term neighbors detailing a history of aggressive shouting matches and domestic disturbance calls originating from the Dublin estate. By the Christmas holidays, Ethan had been awarded emergency temporary physical custody. By the arrival of February, the court finalized full permanent custody in his favor, granting Chloe only strictly supervised visitation sessions that could only commence after she successfully fulfilled a comprehensive, state-certified family counseling program centered on domestic violence intervention. She never bothered to enroll. Chloe, as it turned out, possessed no coping mechanisms for a reality where she was no longer the dominant party in the room. Sterling's criminal trial commenced on March 9th. Ethan chose to remain home to shield Leo from the environment, but I attended every single session. I sat positioned in the 3rd row directly behind the prosecution's table, wearing a tailored blue suit I had acquired specifically for the proceedings. Sterling noticed my presence on the opening morning of the trial and immediately averted his eyes. He never looked toward my section of the gallery again. Beatrice had quickly accepted a separate negotiated plea arrangement regarding the corporate title washing charges in direct exchange for her unedited testimony against her husband in the assault trial. On the witness stand, she testified under oath that her husband had consumed a significant amount of alcohol on the afternoon of the assault, that he possessed a documented history of utilizing what she termed an overly aggressive disciplinary approach with their grandson, and that she had remained too intimidated to step in. Her performance on the stand was a calculated display of manufactured remorse. She was undoubtedly minimizing her own complicity, but the physical video evidence rendered her testimony secondary. The jury deliberated for exactly 2 hours and 11 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense jurist named Margaret Yarrow, sentenced Sterling Vance to 5 years in a state correctional facility, specifying a mandatory minimum threshold of 3 full years to be served before any consideration for parole eligibility. She delivered an address from the bench that remains etched in my memory. She looked directly at the defense table and stated that her court had overseen numerous tragic disputes involving adults engaging in physical conflict, which she categorized as human tragedies. However, she emphasized that this offense represented a far more malicious behavior, a situation where a grown man, possessing 3 times the physical mass and 10 times the physical strength of a 9-year-old child, chose to lift that boy like an inanimate object and launch him into a wall with enough force to crack the skeletal structure of his neck, only to sit back down and resume his meal. She concluded by declaring his conduct not merely unlawful, but completely contemptible, noting that while the statutory maximum sentence was insufficient in her estimation, she was bound to enforce the limits of the law. Sterling was formally remanded into custody and led from the courtroom in restraints without looking at a single person in the room. In the corridor outside the courtroom, the assistant district attorney shook my hand firmly, thanking me for the meticulous foundation of the case. I deflected the praise, noting that her office had executed the real legal heavy lifting, but she insisted that their success was entirely dependent on the evidence I had secured at the scene. I returned to my home that evening to find Leo waiting for me on the porch steps alongside Cooper. He had been cleared to remove his neck brace 2 weeks prior, and he ran down the driveway the moment my sedan came to a stop. He looked up at me anxiously, asking for the final outcome. I lifted him up fully, ignoring the protest from my joints, and looked him in the eyes. I assured him that the man who hurt him was going away for a very long time, and that he would never be able to harm anyone ever again. Leo questioned if it would be forever, and I told him it would be long enough that by the time the sentence concluded, Leo would be grown up enough that no one would ever dare attempt to intimidate him again. He processed that statement quietly for a moment, then smiled and asked if it was finally time for us to go fishing. We made good on that promise the following weekend, heading north to my brother's cabin on the shores of Lake Caspian. Leo ended up reeling in a 14-inch brook trout, the absolute biggest catch of his life. When I took the photo, his smile was so wide it seemed to take over his entire face, displaying a prominent gap where one of his front teeth had recently fallen out. I still keep that picture in a polished frame right on my mantle. As the spring thaws arrived in May, Chloe made an unannounced attempt to re-enter our lives. She showed up on my front porch on a quiet Saturday afternoon, looking noticeably thinner with her hair styled in a completely different manner. I later discovered she had recently completed a costly private rehabilitation program funded entirely by her mother's remaining assets. Standing outside my door, she quietly asked if she could step inside. I blocked the entryway, giving her a simple, firm refusal. She began to plead, stating she desperately needed to offer an apology to Ethan and Leo. I informed her flatly that neither of them were present, as Ethan had taken our boy to a youth soccer match. She paused, looking down before asking if she could at least offer her apology to me. I looked at her for a long, silent moment. In that brief window, my mind flashed back to the fishing card I had lovingly sketched for Leo's birthday, and the cold, neat handwriting she had used to reject it. I remembered her sitting at that dining table, calmly thanking her father after he had shattered our world. I told her she could say whatever she had come to say and that I would extend her the courtesy of listening, but I would guarantee absolutely nothing beyond that. The tears came immediately. She wept on my porch, insisting she was deeply sorry for her actions. She explained that she had spent her entire childhood living in absolute terror of Sterling, and that her entire adult life had been a desperate, twisted attempt to earn his approval, because she simply didn't know any other way to exist. She confessed to feeling an intense, burning jealousy toward the deep bond Ethan shared with me. A quiet, unassuming father who drove an old car and lived a simple life. She admitted she felt a compulsive need to minimize Ethan, believing that by making her husband appear small, her father would remain towering and powerful, and power was the only definition of love she had ever been taught to recognize. I stood there and absorbed her words without a single interruption. When her explanation finally ran dry, she stood waiting on the porch, desperately hoping for a word of comfort or absolution. I looked at her and stated calmly that while I appreciated her willingness to speak, and even believed her remorse might be genuine, she was not entitled to my forgiveness. I told her she was not entitled to Ethan's grace, and she was absolutely not entitled to access Leo. I made it clear that if she truly desired a relationship with her son, she would have to earn it precisely the way the family court had mandated, incrementally, step by step, through supervised visits, professional counseling, and the slow passage of time. I told her she couldn't simply apologize her way back into his life. She had to do the hard work of walking back in, a process that would take years and offered no guarantees of success. She gave a muted nod, using her sleeve to dry her eyes, and asked if I would at least inform Ethan that she had come by. I promised her I would pass along the message. She then asked if I would tell him she was sorry, and I agreed to convey her words. She turned slowly and began descending the porch steps, but stopped at the bottom. She looked back up at me, a lingering question in her eyes, and asked if I was the one who had triggered the Revenue Service investigation into her father's empire. I kept my expression entirely unreadable. I told her simply that her father had chosen to engage in systemic fraud for years, and the authorities had eventually caught up with his operations, concluding that it had absolutely nothing to do with me. She stared at me for a long, heavy interval, searching my face, before giving a slow, knowing nod and walking back to her vehicle. I never revealed the truth to her, but I will share it with you. I made exactly 2 phone calls that evening from the bathroom. That was the entirety of my involvement. I reached out to 2 trusted colleagues from my career, detailed precisely what I had witnessed with my own eyes, and inquired what a concerned citizen should do with that information within the bounds of the law. Every single event that unfolded afterward was simply the natural machinery of justice operating precisely the way it was engineered to run. Sterling Vance laid the groundwork for his own destruction. I merely ensured that the individuals tasked with enforcement were paying attention. That is the critical boundary separating personal vengeance from true justice. Vengeance is a hollow, private satisfaction, while justice is a transparent, public accountability. Vengeance demands that you compromise your own integrity, whereas justice requires only that you refuse to look away from the truth. I am 68 years old today. I have resided in this modest suburban home for over 3 decades. I still drive my 15-year-old sedan, and I still look for weekly discounts at the grocery store on Tuesday mornings. My grandson spends almost every weekend under my roof alongside his father now, primarily because his new school is situated closer to Ethan's apartment. But Leo genuinely loves our sprawling backyard, and he spends hours down in my basement workshop where I am slowly teaching him the patience of wood carving. He is 10 years old now. 2 full years have elapsed since that autumn family dinner. The nightmares have ceased entirely, and he sleeps peacefully through the night. He laughs with genuine abandon at the cartoons on the screen. He has formed a tight friendship with a neighborhood kid named Theo. They spend their afternoons racing bicycles down the street and playing organized youth hockey. It isn't football. Leo had approached his father to ask if he could try the ice instead, and Ethan had looked him in the eye and given him an enthusiastic yes. On certain quiet evenings after Leo has gone to sleep, Ethan and I will sit out on the back porch together. We don't feel the need to fill the space with endless conversation. We just sit in the darkness and listen to the rhythm of the crickets. During one of those evenings last autumn, he reached across the space, placed his hand firmly on my shoulder, and offered a quiet thank you. For all the years I kept my past quiet, and for the exact night I chose to reveal it. I didn't offer a spoken reply. I simply placed my hand over his in the dark. People are going to look at you throughout your entire life and make instant judgments about your worth based entirely on the brand of car you drive, the price of the clothes you wear, and how loudly you command attention in a room. My advice is to let them. Let them form their assumptions. Let them be completely wrong. The individuals who actually matter in this world will always discern your true character eventually, and the ones who don't matter will live their lives without ever truly knowing you. And that is perfectly fine. It is exactly as it should be. I am the uninteresting senior driving the brown sedan. I am also the man who made the call. If this story of quiet justice resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and take care of each other out there.